Okay, guys, welcome to week 13. We are diving into performance art, body art, and the rise of feminism, which I'm really excited about, which is great because after this week, we'll be able to move into talking a little more about contemporary art. Some of your artists that you chose for major assignment 3 will be in this PowerPoint as well, so keep an eye out for them. So we're going to start to break down some of these ideas and elements. We are looking at performance art, and I'm going to give you an idea a little bit about performance art and performance scholarship in general. So I do have some links that go along with the performance artists as well. So some of them will be a little different from the ones in the video, but I'll make sure the PowerPoint is up to date so that you'll be able to click on them and get a look at them, because it's good to see the actual works of art versus us just talking about them. It's a little sort of easier to understand and comprehend. So we'll break down performance art and feminism, and then start really diving into some contemporary themes for next week as well. So performance art and studies really began in the 60s and 70s. And we're going to talk about performance theory first, and sort of the development of that, and then talk about how we see it then in art as well. Very different and distinct ideas. So Richard Schechner is one of the big developers of performance theory. He's not necessarily the best scholar in the world on this topic now, but he was really one of the ones who developed it at length. And so we're going to talk about some of his ideas and some of his theories, as well as theories of other people as well. Other scholars that are really well known for their work in performance theory as well are Judith Butler. She was one of the main performance theorists in gender performativity specifically, and we'll talk about that. But there's a lot of different sources. If you're interested in this sort of information for your final project, or whatever, that's great. Keep all of these documents in mind as we move forward here in talking about what performance theory is. So we talk about performance theory, it's really sort of this avant-garde experimental form. What really happens is sort of this radical and orthodox sort of reinterpretation of art and how we make art. And this is really what we've been talking about up to this point anyway, but it's going to get a name for itself in the 60s and 70s as performance art. And we'll see that in the actions and reactions of artists and their work. So when we talk about performances, there is a large understanding of performance in general. But performances are actions. They are the actual doing of something typically. So the behavior is the object of study. Artistic practice is a big part of performance study project. There's anthropological study of the participant observation, and performance often involves social practices and advocacies. So what you'll see often is the performance of activism in some particular way, which you're performing to get people to join your cause in particular. So this is all going to start out sort of vague at first, but keep these ideas in mind as we start to talk about art and actions and theater, etc. Now, performance itself can also be something you do with words. So in the way that you say something can be doing something. This is called performativity. And this is just the performance of an action with your words itself, or a speech act. And this is typically defined in something like a wedding, a ritual act itself. So you call in like a wedding, when you say I do, or I take this man to be like my lawful married husband, or I bequeath this to my brother, you are doing the action itself, and it's reiterating the action in the statement you make. So this is sort of how you define and understand performativity of words within the understanding of performance itself. We've talked a little bit about museum culture and sort of how we understand this in the context of institutional critique. So objects in museums can be understood as practices, events, behaviors, not just objects and things. So you can see an object in a museum, let's say the Mona Lisa, and it's not only the work itself, but it's the history of it, the way people view it, the way that it has changed over time in interpretation, in different contexts. The Mona Lisa, in particular, is stolen and then gets back into the Louvre, and so it gains all this sort of notoriety and interest because of this performance that happens with that object. So when we talk about museum culture, you don't have to just think of performance as a theatrical performance in that people are doing something on stage that's very particularly scripted. Performance is also about the way people interact with objects, how objects have stories themselves, etc. So many things can be interpreted as performances. So you have to think about objects in a museum as a performance itself too. So you have to think about all these things. It's very important to the study of art history how you understand object performance in the context of performance at large. So performances exist in these actions, interactions, and relationships, and these objects can then hold those performances over time. So you have to, I know some of these sort of seem vague and distant since we haven't really had time to read about performance theory and performance art. Hopefully we'll have some time to do that in the future. But really think about how objects contain performance over time. So I'll give you some examples how you would see this sort of in your everyday life. So when you think about something like social media, right, and texting, something that's not been a performance till recently, people perform in a particular way when they're displaying themselves on Instagram, when they're texting other individuals, when they show images of themselves on Facebook. You're not showing yourself exactly how it is. It's often a performance to show your best self or who you would like to be. So you have to think about all these ways that you interact with social media yourself. So you could think about someone like Asenya O'Neil, and I don't know if you guys heard about this when it happened, but on Instagram she came out and sort of said that all of her photographs were fake, that she posed for all these things, that it wasn't real, she doesn't own the dress, this is not her life. She's been all this time posing and trying to show this very particular way that she wanted to appear. However, none of this was real life. It really wasn't who she was or what she was doing with her life. And so the quote from her is, "Social media isn't real. It's purely contrived images and edited clips ranked against each other, and it consumed me." So you could think about the way that people perform on social media, the way that they want you to think that they are and who they are. And then this comes a lot from the idea of twice behaved behaviors. So when you think about performing in your everyday life and who you are, there's this sort of way that you interact and do the same things that people have done in the past. You behave the same way every day. You have a routine, these things that you do because either you've been taught to do them or society tells you to do them, etc. So in fact, the everydayness of everyday life is precisely its familiarity. It's being built from known bits of behavior, rearranged and shaped in order to suit specific circumstances. There's this everyday ritual activity of reenacting learned behavior that you have. And it's sort of years and years of training as a child, right, to become this person that you are every day. So how you grow up, nature, nurture, right, teaches you what you are supposed to do and who you are supposed to be and how you are supposed to enact those everyday performances in your own life. So a lot of that links into gender performativity itself. So something that Judith Butler would talk about in her works. And you have this because sex and gender are culturally defined. They're not things that exist. So when you talk about gender of someone, the way that women are pink and men are blue, women wear dresses, men wear pants, all of these things are socially constructed through performance, right? It's an over years and decades and centuries of people doing these things have taught you that that's what you're supposed to do. Women wear high heels and jewelry, men don't, right? And that's where you get people not being able to understand homosexuality or people who participate in drag because they're going against the construction of gender that exists and has existed. Um, if gender is the social construction of sex, and if there's no access to this sex except by means of its construction, then it appears not only that sex is absorbed by gender, but that sex becomes something like a fiction, perhaps a fantasy, retroactively installed at a pre-linguistic site to which there is no direct access. And it's hard to say where and how these things occur, because they're so embedded in who we are today as a society. And this could change from culture to culture, depending on who you are and where you grew up. The United States has sort of one view of gender, very sort of strict and particular, whereas you have other European countries that are not necessarily as strict about how they understand gender and sexuality. So these norms over and over and over help you to identify and re-identify who you are as a person. And when you start observing those things and thinking about them is when you start to understand how you can go against those things. And you don't have to agree with Judith Butler and this understanding of yourself in performance theory. It's just about understanding those things anthropologically. Oh, what happened to my PowerPoint? Well, anyway, so that over time you can see how that affects you, and just so that you're aware of those things in general and how you understand how they affect you. I'm not sure how this got wonky. Okay. So Butler and Schechner have talked about religion as a performance. You can think about how religion is very rooted in ritual and the doing of different acts over and over again to produce similar effects. So you can think about something like the blood of Saint Janarius is a ritual in which the Pope takes out this dried blood of a saint. If the blood liquefies, then you will be protected for a certain amount of time. If it doesn't, and it stays dry, that is bad luck. And people do this every year, and people base the protection of the city and its well-being on whether or not this blood will liquefy. So you can see people interacting with some of these concepts and ideas evolved in ritual. You also have this with something like reliquaries, in which people are containing the physical remains of saints that can enact miracles or can provide some sort of ritual activity for you. So these are kind of funny ones. I have like the umbilical cord of Christ as well as his foreskin, and they believe that there is a power in these objects itself, that they contain some sort of ritual or miracle producing power. So these performances and behaviors can change over time, depending on the decade or century and how people view things. So you can think about something like hysteria. This was an issue until the 1980s. It was a way to describe women's sexuality, the belief that women sort of had this uncontrollable emotional sexuality, and the only way to sort of control it was the treatment of women with masturbation. You would go to a doctor and be treated for these things. It was very strange and very grotesque, and it sort of started these concepts of using the vibrator, and they were the ones that first created the vibrator because they believed that this was an actual medical condition, right? And how we understand that today, obviously, does not exist anymore. Something that you might be a little more familiar with is the idea of the teenager, something that changes over time, right? And the way that you think about the youth, teenagers, right, that change then over until millennials is different every year. So performance art is really going to take off and develop theories that we were talking about. Sorry, I got a little cut off there at the end. But it's really going to take off in the 60s and 70s. And again, this is the same sort of time period that we've been discussing. It comes a lot from Dada, Situationalist, Fluxus, installation art, conceptual art, etc. As I've seen in readings, they define some of these artists as conceptual artists, and I would move them actually to performance art, which is why I've put them in this presentation and not that one. So you'll notice that with Vito Conci. He's featured in the conceptual art chapter that we read, but I would actually consider him to be a performance artist. So when we think about these things, it's a lot about challenging theater, the visuality of what a performance is and isn't. A lot of it is not traditional theater, obviously. They're moving and using gallery spaces sort of as their stage. Could be outside the gallery as well. It really depends on the artist and the way they work. A lot of it is interdisciplinary. You have media, video, numerous different ways that artists are using performance and performance art. And again, it's something that they don't want to have commodified. You don't want, this is something that a museum can purchase. And of course, this does end up happening, again, like we've stated a million times, right? Somehow, some way, a museum will purchase a work and have sort of control over that performance, which is really interesting. So a museum can't hold on to that work and be the only ones that present that in any sort of performance context. So artists like that, some don't. It sort of depends on each one. A lot of the elements that are included in performance art are time, space, the performance body, and the relationship between the performer and the audience. This is really important to a lot of the works, is interacting with the audience itself. And again, this is something that we've seen in conceptual art, in process art, in minimalism, in land art, right? This is the performance and the interaction between the audience member and the artist, so that these lines are blurred between what is art and what isn't art, and what is an audience and what isn't an audience, right? This is repeated over and over and over again, really at the core of how we understand art in this time period. So Alan Capro is going to be one of these really important initial artists in performance theory. So he does 18 Happenings in 6 parts in 1959 with a bunch of different artists. And basically there are different areas in which the artist sort of enters and exits, and it makes the audience members interact with people in these different spaces. So it's all very rehearsed, even though it's supposed to be sort of appearing that it does it by chance. And then you interact with these different actors in this space doing different things. So, right, 18 Happenings, something that they're doing sort of spontaneously. And it's supposed to appear that you're supposed to be sort of surprised by these moments of interaction, but it's all sort of very rehearsed. So it's very fragmented. Each individual audience member has a different interaction with those things and what you see, and people interact with those performers. So sometimes it's with like musical instruments, sometimes it's with people doing these weird sort of actions. So each person goes into the gallery and experiences some different type of happening that's occurring. A lot of his work reflected art and everyday life, just these small sort of insignificant actions that happen over time and within a space, and creates them right as some sort of art or art action itself. Robert Morris, who we saw doing sort of minimalism and conceptual art early on, he's also going to be known in the performance scene as well. And we can sort of understand that because some of his works come off as, they talk about them as like theater props, or to that extent. And so he's going to come and do some performance work in this sphere as well. Here's another work that we looked at by him from minimalism. So he's going to do Sight in 1965, and he's going to do it with Carolee Schneemann, who's a very, very important performance artist in body art. So we'll talk about her in a minute. But she's going to be posed as Monet's Olympia. If you haven't seen this painting before, look it up. And she's going to be sitting in this space, and she's going to be completely confined within these walls that slowly over time Robert Morris is going to be removing away to reveal her. And as this happens, you're going to have a jackhammer playing in the background, as well as sort of these like dance movements that Morris is going to be interacting with. He's also going to be wearing a mask made of Jasper Johns, so this very strange sort of concealment of who he is, with the sort of physical concealment of Carolee Schneemann as well. And so he's going to open it up and display her, and then at the end, she's going to be covered up again with the walls. So this very interesting and weird interaction with the space, commentary on what art is, the way you hide it or display it. It's something like displaying these walls in this performance by Robert Morris. Something that's maybe a little more, a little easier to understand, because Robert Morris can be a little vague in his work, would be Gilbert and George. And work that they do is really interesting because they're living sculptures. So they're going to sing and interact, but they're going to move like they're sort of robots. So they're going to go in and talk about the living body as the art object itself, living sculptures, commenting on this sort of traditional form, replacing it with the physical body or self, and this understanding that there's no need to separate art and life, they're sort of connected together. So this is the first video to watch Gilbert and George doing Underneath the Arches from 1969. And you'll see how they use their live bodies as a way to be like little sculptures. And they'll comment on this traditional art form. And they're going to be singing about this man who slept on the railway arches in the Great Depression and commenting on a lot of these themes while being this really interesting human sculpture itself. And that's going to translate into body art. And we'll sort of see that transition as we move through these different works. So that's the first video to watch. So take time to go and watch that and then come back to the presentation. Okay? Joseph Beuys is another really important performance artist from this time period. One of his works, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hair, from 1965. This is very connected with ritual and transformation process. So I'll read sort of this general synopsis of the work because it's very odd. So at the beginning of the performance, Beuys locked the gallery doors from the inside, leaving the gallery goers outside. They could observe the scene within only through the windows. With his head entirely coated in honey and gold leaf, he began to explain pictures to a dead hare, and you can see the hare is the bunny here. Whispering to the dead animal on his arm in an apparent dialogue, he processed through the exhibit from artwork to artwork. Occasionally he would stop and return to the center of the gallery, where he stepped over a dead fir tree that lay on the floor. After 3 hours the public was let into the room. Beuys sat upon a stool in the entrance area with the hare on his arm and his back to the onlookers. So this really strange interaction with animal and with the way that you understand being a viewer and how you reinterpret the museum and museum culture and transformation in everyday life. It's very strange, but it really makes you rethink how we understand and view art and what art history is. Another one of his, I Like America and America Likes Me, he travels to America in 1974. This is one of the only few times that he goes to New York, but it's really interesting. I'm going to read again this synopsis for you. Beuys flew to New York, picked up by an ambulance, and swathed in felt, was transported to a room in the Red Block Gallery. The room was also occupied by a wild coyote, and for a period of 8 hours a day for the next 3 days, Beuys spent his time with the coyote in a small room, with little more than a felt blanket and a pile of straw. While in the room, the artist engaged in symbolist gestures, such as striking a triangle and tossing his gloves to the coyote. At the end of 3 days, the coyote, who had become quite tolerant of Beuys, allowed a hug from the artist, who was transported back to the airport via ambulance. He never set foot outside on American soil, nor saw anything of America other than the coyote and inside of the gallery. Sorry about that. That's what I get for recording lectures in the middle of peak delivery time of my mail, apparently. My FedEx people are rude. Anyway, so as I was saying, Joseph Beuys went into this space, and he was supposed to be sharing, it was the idea of sharing a space with this coyote and interacting sort of with America and the animals of America without really getting to know America at all. And he thought it was a reflection of how we understand sort of the American Indian or Native American and their persecution. So he was making a commentary about how he felt America had reacted to Native American persecution and this very sort of interesting and strange performance itself. Another really interesting performance artist is going to be Laurie Anderson, and she's going to work in video and music, which is really interesting. And so you'll see there's going to be two different videos that you watch. But the artist is really going to talk about everyday life through electronic media, and she's going to talk through a synthesizer. It's really this very interesting experimental theater and music. It's very important for insider art. So you're going to watch two different videos. One being Oh Superman, which reached great heights in the United Kingdom as a work of art, as well as her album United States, and the song Match 20, which is really funny as well. So they have this very comedic song construct, and you'll see sort of how she interprets body and song in her own work. Now, this last work that I'm going to talk about before we get into body art, because he sort of leads into it as an artist, is Herman Nitsch. And he's going to do this work called Orgies, Mysteries Theaters in the 1970s, which is going to be repeated over time. He's going to do different reiterations of this work. So you're going to see, he wrote this drama that lasted about 6 days originally, and he sort of decided over time that traditional media such as paint or sculpture really didn't say what he wanted to say about art, and he decided instead to use materials such as milk, blood, meat, vinegar, wine, to stimulate the senses and touch and taste, and this connection again between art and life, and he wanted to reduce the idea of pictures and art to its sort of pure form, and be purely material. So in this work, you have Dionysus, who's considered the destructive fertility god in his story, and who embodies sort of the primal principle of being, and then Christ, who we understand sacrificed himself for love. And it's going to showcase human existence itself through birth, life, death, and rebirth, as well as myth and ritual. So what you're going to see in this is this very ritual in action with destruction, with the sacrifice of animals. So I'm warning you now, these images are a little graphic. You do have the slaughtering of an animal and them kind of wiping their body and blood and guts and whatnot. And so if you're not interested in seeing it, don't watch this last minute or two of the work. But it's about calling to act these like sort of old rituals and ideas of killing and blood and sacrificing. And it's sort of sadomasochistic and cathartic, but it's also about this like myth and understanding of ritual. So I'll show you those images now. So you're going to see in his work, he really wants to comment on the removal of blood and death from our lives and bringing it back in, kind of separated from our food and sacrificing, and he's trying to sort of bring this back in this ritual sense in his work. So Herman Nitsch is really going to, is a good transition into body art and how we understand body art. This is sort of a subsection of performance and performance art and theory, and it's going to be taking the artist's own body as a subject and object of work. So it's a lot about what limits of the flesh can experience, forced to witness private, sort of violent acts against one's own body, using your body, and to see sort of at what lengths you can push it. So a lot of this is going to be inherited and linked into female sexuality and feminism. You'll see that in some of these works as well. But you'll see this really interesting way in which artists are using their body as a work of art. So one of the popular body art and artists of the time is Yoko Ono. I know most people know her, right, because of John Lennon and other experiences in the music world, but she's in fact a very well-known body artist and performance artist. Her most well-known piece being Cut Piece from 1966. Here again is a video of that. And you'll see here, Yoko Ono sits in a stage where people are invited to come and cut pieces of her clothing off, and it's sort of theirs to keep. And at the beginning of this sort of experimentation, people would come up and cut sort of a small piece off, and be very sort of gentle and kind to her. And then over time, you would see people start to cut away her bra straps, her shirt, try to expose her, and to become this very interesting understanding of what limits you could push your audience members to. And so you see how something that seems quite innocent at first can become quite nefarious. And this is actually going to be popular when we see Abramovic's work as well. She's going to see how you push sort of your audience members to see what they're capable of doing. And her work ended at her discretion, so she was able to just get up and leave when she felt the work was sort of concluded or she wasn't comfortable. Here's some more images, and again, stop the lecture so you could go and view that video of her. She's also going to produce a book called Grapefruit. If you ever get time to get your hands on this book, it is really interesting and wonderful. In this book, she gives you little poems and little actions to do. So you get to interact with this book in a very interesting and object way, in which you reinterpret how you look and think about a book. I think at the end it tells you to light the book on fire and burn it. So it's really interesting how you read this book and understand some of her work. One of my favorites is a poem called Heide's Piece. Hide until everybody goes home. Hide until everybody forgets about you. Hide until everybody dies. 1964, spring. And so you can see her way of interacting with you as an audience member in reading her book, and how you sort of think about the interesting ways in which she interprets art and art objects. Chris Burden is also one of those artists that really pushes the limits of his physical body and form. One of his well-known works is Shoot from 1971, in which he has one of his friends shoot him and graze his arm, and here you see his injury here. The idea obviously wasn't to kill him, but it was instead to make a commentary about sort of the dissident effects of cinema and violence. A lot of his work is about violence and how we sort of become accustomed to violence in many ways. And so he brought sort of audience members in to see him get shot by his friend. So this very weird commentary on violence. He does another one in which it's called Transfixed, in which he nails himself to the top of a Volkswagen Beetle. So again, this is another experimentation with ritual. He was protesting the Vietnam War at the time, which Yoko Ono is also going to do in some of her early work, as well as Murakami and other artists. And so this television violence is happening all the time. And so he's violating his own body to make a commentary about these very sort of sadistic things that are occurring in media and television. Vito Conci is another one of those artists. I talked about him briefly, that people consider him a conceptual artist, which I disagree with. I typically consider him to be a body artist or performance artist. But his work is very graphic, again, in the way that he experiments with his body. So one of them here is to bite into his own flesh and leave these sort of marks on his body. And he could bite himself sort of as hard as he could, and he would make imprints. So he'd rub ink on the indentation itself and imprint it on a page, literally making an object out of his physical form. And so he did this, and he took images, and again, he's playing with what an art object is. Is it then that you can sell these pieces of imprints of his teeth and his skin? What does that mean if the art world wants to buy something like this? These very highly physical, grotesque images. Akanchi is also really known for works such as Following Piece in 1969. This work was in the reading that we did, in which he randomly chose a person from a building, followed them around, and had someone who photographed the entire experience. So again, it's this relationship between artist and viewer. Do you know that you're being followed by this artist? Do you feel like you're being followed? How does that make you act differently? Why is Akanchi doing this? Why is it important? Why is it interesting? And you sort of take that work as it is. Another work that he did was Seedbed in 1972. This one has really shocked a lot of people, in which he made a gallery space, and he built this floor on top of the gallery floor and sort of slanted it. And people would come in and walk around and hear this very sort of strange and distant noise, but that was it. And then they left the room. And they came to find out that underneath the floorboards, Vito Conchi was watching every viewer that came into the room on a video monitor, and he was masturbating to the images of them, and the sounds in the gallery were the sounds of him underneath the floorboards. So it was this really strange connection with the viewer, this really sort of massive violation of trust, of sexuality, of ethical art making. It crossed over this line between what is public, what is private, and really sort of made the whole event sort of grotesque to anyone who sort of participated, and made this sort of commentary on the art object itself. Carolee Schneemann is going to be a really important feminist artist to the performance and body art movements. She's really going to be the first American to bring performance to body art in the 60s, and she's going to take her female physical form as visual territory. So in something like iBody, she's going to cover herself in this, she takes this space, she covers herself in paint, glue, fur, feathers, garden snakes, glass, and plastic, and she's exploring her body as the flesh and material of an installation itself. She takes images of it. It's very erotic. She sort of becomes the over-sexualized image of a female in these works, and they're very over-sexualized and dramatic. She's going to push this even further with something like Interior Scroll. She did a lot of different actions and reactions in her work, but in this one, she pulls a small scroll out of her vagina and she reads from it. And it's all of these different female needs and what women need help with, and the things that they do. Oh, they're just supposed to be in the kitchen. So she's reading all this sort of feminist needs in literature, and she's sort of slowly pulling it out of her vagina and startling all of these male critics with her work, because it was something that they really hadn't seen before, women being comfortable with their body and using their vagina as sort of the holder of art itself, taking back sexuality and being sort of talked about as an art object, taking that back for women. Orlan is also a really important artist in this time for very similar actions as Carolee Schneemann. So in this work, La Basière de l'Artiste, which is The Kiss of the Artist in 1977, and she was talking about art as prostitution and her body and the way that men use body the female body in their work, and how they're sort of sexualized and over-sexualized. And so in her work, she created this sort of installation, and there's different parts of this work, one in which she would sit in this installation, and other where she would walk around with this structure on her body. But it basically turned herself into this massive slot machine in which people would put money into this paper form, and it would travel down to her crotch or vagina, and people would then get to kiss her. So they were paying for this kiss. And the process was the idea of the prostitution of the artist herself. And you could think of being an artist as sort of a prostitution if you feel like you're being misused for your sexuality. And so you'll see works of her walking around and people kissing her, this very strange interaction and sexuality with the audience members. A lot of her later work is going to involve plastic surgery and the way that we understand plastic surgery in contemporary culture. So you can see her changing sort of her body art over time and how she uses her physical form. Marina Abramovic is really going to be one of these great artists of body art. She's still important today in the contemporary art scene. And she's going to do a series of rhythms. And all of them are going to be about interacting with audience members, making them feel particular things, making them act a particular way, and using her own body as sort of the material for her work. So in this one, in Rhythm 10, she's going to take a knife and stab between each one of her fingers into a rhythm that she's doing, has playing overhead. And she's going to try to keep up with the rhythm as fast as she can with these knives. And she's going to move from knife to knife. And I believe every time she stabbed herself or missed, she had to pick up a different knife and start again. And she does this all the way through with all the different sharp objects she has, and then she replays a recording of her doing this with the music, and she tries to repeat it exactly like she did before. So this includes purposely stabbing herself where she stabbed herself before. So she's really testing the limits of her body and how she can sort of repeat these rituals over and over again. One of her really well-known works that connects very directly with Yoko Ono and Cut Piece is Rhythm Zero from 1974. And this was basically for a 6-hour period. This group of viewers could do anything that they wanted to her for this amount of time. And they had a table of objects that they could do anything they wanted with. So 72 objects, like a rose, feather, perfume, honey, bread, grapes, wine, scissors, scalpel, nails, metal bar, and a gun loaded with 1 bullet. And so instructions were given. There are 72 objects on the table that one can use on me as desired. Performance. I am the object. During this period, I take full responsibility. 6 hours, 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. And it sort of, at first, was very gentle. People were handing her flowers and repeating poetry to her. And then towards the end, in the 3rd hour, they start to cut her skin with the thorns of the flower. They held the gun to her head. They cut her clothes off. People were fighting each other to stop them. And so you see the interaction of the artist is sort of crying, and part of the idea was not to stop anybody from what they were doing. And so she continues the performance until the end, and she was actually feared that she would die in some capacity. And at the end, like, people ran away thinking that she would confront them or something, and she did not. So it was this really grotesque way that you see the viewers and people, once they're sort of shoved in this area, what they'll be propelled to do over time in a space. So with this work by Abramovic, I did forget that I had a description of sort of happened what hour by hour by by a critic who was there. So I'm going to read that to you here as well. It began tamely. Someone turned her around, Someone thrust her arms into the air. The Neapolitan night began to heat up. In the third hour, all of her clothes were cut from her with razor blades. In the fourth hour, the same blades began to explore her skin. Her throat was slashed so someone could suck her blood. Various minor sexual assaults were carried out on her body. She was committed to the peace that she would have resisted rape or murder. That she would not have resisted rape or murder. Faced with her abdication of will, with its implied collapse of human psychology, a protective group began to define itself in the audience. When a loaded gun is thrust at Marina's head and her own finger was being worked around the trigger, a fight broke out between audience factions. This is Thomas McEvely, an art critic. And so she really was experimenting with how far a viewer could be pushed, like I stated before. And the importance of the viewer is really a big part of her work in general. And you're going to see that in other works, such as House with an Ocean View from 2002, in which she spends 12 days in a gallery in a space and didn't eat or sleep or have any privacy, and the viewer is just going to interact with her in this space. She's just going to be there, and they're going to be there in the same space. So here's a video, another video here, which is video number 5. You get to watch her being in a Sex and the City episode, which is kind of funny. Another really important work of hers is The Artist is Present. She's redone this one innumerable times. If you have seen this video, I don't know why I'm not writing the video numbers on here. If you have seen this video, it's her meeting one of her, let's see if I numbered it on here. Okay, yeah, video 6, good. Okay, so it is her interacting with a past lover, as you get to see her reaction to seeing him in this space. So it's really interesting in itself. And it was kind of a popular video at one point or another, so if you have seen it before, you'll know what I'm talking about. So all of this work is really going to lead to a rise of feminism, and really the second wave of feminism in particular. And you're going to see that in all of these artists, these body artists and performance artists leading up to this point are really interacting with these new constructs of the second wave of feminism. And this is going to really occur in 1963 with The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And she's going to write this at the time because she's going to interview and conduct a survey for her Smith College classmates at their 15th anniversary reunion. And what she sort of finds out, she was originally going to write an article and ends up writing this massive piece of literature that's important today to her work, to feminism, and she found out that people just weren't happy. You had all of these women who were living their lives very unhappily and weren't really telling anybody. And so what she ends up doing is making this massive book. So if you think about this historic time period, if I can get my PowerPoint to work, before this you had the first wave of feminism, and you have women gaining more power, were able to vote, people are in World War I, women are able to be taking on the roles of men, taking over their jobs, etc. And then happening right in World War II, you have Rosie the Riveter, you have all of these, this was World War II before, sorry. And World War II with Rosie the Riveter, in which women are taking over these jobs that men have left. So welding and construction, showing that women can do all of these things. And what's going to happen after that, 15 years after World War II, is the men are going to come back from the war and want their jobs back. And the way to sort of get women out of the jobs that they've been doing all this time during World War II, where they want to stay, is to sort of push them into a new role as this very perfect 1950s housewife. So that's where this construct comes from, in that they want to push women out of the work scene to give the jobs back to the men. And so it promotes this world of advertising in which women are represented as only being able to be housewives and mothers and stay in the home, protect the home. So I'm going to show you a bunch of different advertisements, and you can take a look at them while I sort of read what was said about women in magazines at the time. And you'll see how society and different individuals were sort of able to manipulate women into thinking this is what they should have been doing. The image of women that emerges from this big, pretty magazine is young and frivolous, almost childlike, fluffy and feminine, passive, gaily content in a world of bedroom and kitchen, sex, babies, and home. The magazine surely does not leave out sex. The only passion, the only pursuit, the only goal a woman is permitted is the pursuit of a man. It is crammed full of clothing, cosmetics, furniture, and the physical bodies of young women. But where is the world of thought and ideas, the life of mind and spirit? In the magazine image, women do not work except housework and work to keep their bodies beautiful and to get to keep a man. And so you can see in these images all the really negative ways that women are being represented in their sort of passive role to men. And the way that they're supposed to be viewed at the time is as sort of passive and fluffy figures who are concerned either about housework, about maintaining their perfect looks, etc. Another clip that I have for you guys to watch is from Mona Lisa Smile from 2003. And it really gives you a good idea of what's happening to women at this time and how women are viewing themselves. There is this sort of degree you would get in college, right? Women would go to college to land a husband. And your degree was a PhD, which is putting husband through. So you would drop out of school eventually and go to take care of the home. And this, of course, led to women not being very happy with their lives. And you can see, if you've ever seen this film, you can see the sort of discontentment with women over time with this role that they've sort of been pushed into, and the sort of internal conflicts that they have with one another. So you'll see this in this video, number 7, in which women are rethinking their roles in society and who they should be, and you'll see that sort of in this depiction of Julia Roberts as an art history teacher at Wellesley College. Other ways that they sort of talked about women were encouraging them not to vote and not be involved in politics. And it's really crazy because you have not 60 years earlier, women fighting with their lives to protect their right to vote, and magazines then coming out in 1960, if you're a woman, don't vote. In the pre-19th Amendment era, the American woman was placid, sheltered and sure of her role in American society. She left all the political decisions to her husband, and he, in turn, left all the family decisions to her. Today, a woman has to make both the family and the political decisions, and it's too much for her. And so women were taught that they shouldn't want careers, they shouldn't want higher education or political rights or to vote because it was too much for them. And they needed to be focused on these more frivolous actions, such as taking care of their physical form and their homes. And so you see these sort of startling statistics in the 50s and 60s. Average married age was 20, 14 million women were engaged at the age of 17. Women were going to college 47% in 1920 to 35% in 1958. 60% of them dropping out of college once married, a grand PhD, putting husbands through. Women having more children, passing India in birth rate. And then 3 out of 10 women are dyeing their hair. They're involved, dyeing their hair blonde in particular. And being forced to sort of maintain this role. And you can see also in advertisements that they're pushed to not eat. One of these sort of chalky meals was Metrecal, a quote being from that, "Face it, you've got to stop eating." And people eventually obviously grew to hate this pink goopy nonsense that they were promoting as food. And so, of course, what happens when Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique is that women are inherently, the mystique of the whole thing is that women are happy, which of course is not true. You have all of these psychiatrists going out and being like, oh, women are not content, they're not happy, and they think, oh, well, they just don't have enough of this or enough of that. and we're not really seeing the inherent problem, which is that women are being forced into a role that they don't necessarily always want to be doing. Um, the feminist mystique says the highest value and the only commitment for women is the fulfillment of their own femininity. It says that the great mistake of Western culture through most of its history has been the undervaluation of this femininity. It says that femininity is so mysterious and intuitive and close to the creation and origin of life that man-made sciences were never able to understand it. The mistake, says the mystique, the root of women's troubles in the past is that women envied men. Women tried to be like men instead of accepting their own nature, which can find fulfillment only in sexual passivity, male domination, and nurturing, maternal love. And so, women were inherently miserable. There was this idea of the housewife syndrome. Women felt that they had no personality. They were blaming women's dissatisfaction with their lives on the fight for their rights. And again, psychiatrists found that most unmarried women were happier than married women. And it was because of this social construct that they created. And so Betty Friedan releases this book, and people realize that other people aren't happy. They think it's just secluded to them, that they're the only ones that are unhappy. And of course, the woman being unhappy doesn't make the man happy, right? And so you have the breakdown of these social constructs that have developed by the media in the 1950s. And so this book jumpstarts the second wave of feminism in the 1960s and the 1980s. And to make women understand that they did not need to be comfortable with their dissatisfied lives and to start asking questions. And this book connects women over a landscape, right? Before the internet, before this inherent globalization, this book connects women to each other. So this is going to develop the foundation for how we understand the second wave of feminism and feminist art at the time. And really founding artists of that movement are Judy Chicago and Miriam Schapiro. And they move this work sort of from the private into the public, making this work public for people to see, and to take these concepts stereotypical to women, such as needlework, pottery, sewing, knitting, and to make this highly collaborative piece of art that would make people rethink their sort of inherent roles. So Judy Chicago herself, she develops the first feminist art history program at Fresno State College, in California, and she wants to make an opportunity for female art history courses there, and to involve women in the production of art together. Judy Chicago is really known for her use of the word cunt. She thinks it's bringing women together, reconnecting them, re-empowering them through a word that's been misused. And so they're trying to free women from these attitudes, these very negative attitudes about their bodies, and transforming a word like cunt to mean something positive. So you can see in this video number 8, Judy Chicago talking about that, saying cunt over and over a million times. So about 15 students are going to join the class and participate and work with her. It wasn't a popular idea, but these women did decide to do it. And they're going to come together and want to have this personal experience. And so they're going to have studios together and work with one another and re-engage with one another. They wanted to have a space together to work that was away from the college and away from sort of this patriarchy of the college. So the start of their work is going to be them photographing each other, these sort of pre-Cindy Sherman images of costumes and sort of female stereotypical images. So you're going to have women as the doll, as the Victorian whore, as the model, etc. And so this is some of the early work by her students at that time. So she's going to join up with Miriam Schapiro from Cal Arts, and they're going to come together in this collaborative space to make Womanhouse in 1971. And we'll talk about that here now. Watch the video on Womanhouse, and then we'll talk about what that was. So in 6 weeks in 1971, Judy Chicago and Miriam Schapiro are given this home, which is set to be destroyed by the city and condemned in 1972. And they're going to get the property rights to this house to become sort of a living installation for this amount of time until it's destroyed, as a sort of studio and then a representation of their experiences and the female reality. So women, all of these 15 artists, plus Miriam Schapiro, are going to go and develop all these different rooms in the house as part of this sort of installation about women and their personal experiences. So I'm going to show you quite a few images of this work and talk about some of the connection with the images and different artists that work with it. So Pink Kitchen is one by Vicky Hodgett. And there was a connection between mothers and daughters, with light pinks and these eggs as breast shapes. So you kind of can't tell which ones are eggs and which ones are breasts. And you'll see that in the video of Womanhouse from the documentary. This very pinky color. This whole structure was in pink like this whole kitchen painted pink, with these very frilly curtains and boob egg shapes. As stated, the soft skin of a kitchen pink is openers, strainers, blenders, is cups, pots, and hot ovens, is boxes, cans, and glass packages, is faucets and nippled knobs, a toaster, juicer, and waffler, all pink skinned. How would you like your eggs done this morning? Another was a representation of a dining room with additional images of food and plates and decorations, sort of setting up for a dinner, but the objects didn't look very realistic. They look very plastic and sort of unedible. And you can talk about sort of the unrealness of this plastic, very plastic looking dinner, right? With this painting on the wall that was very similar to something Anna Peel artist would have made. You had Menstruation Bathroom by Judy Chicago. This one is very obvious in its representation of women's blood as taboo. Women often hide their periods and their experience of menstruation blood. And here you have all of those objects out in the open. So bloody tampons, bloody garments. So taking those things that women are supposed to find inherently disgusting and hide from the world and put them out in the open in this bathroom. This would be outside the bathroom. Here, the hanging of nylons, right? Sort of the fragmentation of women. Thinking of them as just legs, just boobs, just hair. Thinking of them as just nylons, right? There was another nightmare bathroom, women in a bathtub. She was made out of sand, and people were not supposed to touch her, but they would, and so she would sort of slowly disappear and start sinking into the sand of the water itself. And you had this image of a snake crawling along the ground, maybe a representation of Eve being tempted by the snake and sort of the vulnerability of being in a tub. And you also had sort of cosmetics made out of sand as well, and what sort of that material means. Another bathroom that was featured was Lipstick Bathroom by Camille Gray. This one I think is one of the more powerful ones other than Menstruation Bathroom, in that although it's called Lipstick Bathroom, it gives you a very massive sense of sort of blood and gore on the walls itself. I wouldn't necessarily call it lipstick, even though you have sort of like cosmetics on the sink itself. It's sort of very nefarious looking image. And one connection that I sort of have intrinsically with it is to connect it with something like It, and these images of Stephen King and the representation of a young girl in a bathroom covered in blood. So watch this video quick if you haven't seen it, then I'll talk about it here. So you have Beverly here, and there's some suggestion in both the early film and the current film um, about blood and what that means. The scene where Beverly's father cannot see the blood that covers the bathroom is reminiscent of children saying they have been abused, but no one believing them. The scene also reminds us that the victims of child abuse can see the gory reality, whereas others choose a blind eye. And you very much get the sense in the films that Beverly is being abused by her father or has been in the past, and she's sort of dealing with these things on her own. And this bathroom comes to sort of represent that imagery. And I feel very connected with that image and the lipstick bathroom by Chicago and Schapiro here. Other works include the hanging of aprons. They're sort of the coats of females. Women want to take off their aprons, hang them, and go to the outside and experience life on their own. You have sort of goofy lips and breasts and vaginas embroidered on the aprons themselves. There's also the representation of shoes, right? Women as wearing shoes, as shoes being an important part of their identity, right? Women are the ones that wear high heels. The obsession with women owning shoes and the ability to change your identity with your wardrobe. I've also always read that when artists talk about high heel shoes, it's sort of men made them so that women couldn't run away as fast or something like that. So you could think about all the different ways that shoes are represented and what shoes mean to a woman or otherwise. There are some different crochet environments as well, sort of supposed to be like a womb uh, made out of this sort of ancient female material use. So you have these very interesting webs made out of crocheted material. Women have to sort of crawl out of their own wombs and have to understand who they are. There are different rooms such as the nursery, where all the objects are very big. It's supposed to make the woman who has to grow up very quickly and become a mother and have children of her own. How does she then deal with being a child herself and not having the ability to grow up? And so they have all these structures that women themselves could play with. This very childlike sense that you've been constricted to. Another one was Leah's room. There were a couple different bedrooms that were experienced in this work. Leah's bedroom being one of them, where Leah herself was there and would perform during the opening. A woman would sit there and do her makeup and talk about who she was and sort of this intricacy in how women want to be viewed and experienced in sort of this very pink and frilly room. In the structure itself, there's only two women sort of shown in full body, and that is the closeted woman and the bride. The closeted woman here is sort of separated, right, in this linen closet. She's supposed to be tucked away, ignored. Who she is compartmentalized. You view a woman in parts. And then on the other hand, you have the bride in the staircase, right? This sort of intrinsic fear of who you'll become and what your future is. And the train of the bride, which goes all the way down the staircase, then leads into the pantry and into the kitchen where it ends. So no connection with sexuality and the bedroom or with identity. It's straight into the kitchen, who you were supposed to be represented. So Miriam Schapiro and Judy Chicago are going to make this work, and the students are going to do alternative performances in this space itself. So not only was the structure there for people to come and view the art and the work, but there were also performances that occurred in this space as well. So Cock-Cunt play here for video 11, in which you see sort of the hilariousness of roles and what it means to have a penis versus a vagina. A cunt means you wash the dishes. She looks at her appendage and states, I don't see where it says that on my cunt. So you can watch this video and their connection with the work. Um, Another one is Waiting by Faith Wilding, who does a lot of work in Womanhouse as well. Here she's sitting and rocking on a chair and describing all the different ways in which she has to wait. So this is video 12. She's singing and giving a voice to women, waiting for my breasts to develop, waiting to get married, waiting to hold my baby, waiting for the first gray hair, waiting for my body to break down, to get ugly, waiting for my breasts to shrivel up, waiting for a visit from my children, for letters, waiting to get sick, waiting for sleep. So Judy Chicago, Miriam, Schapiro really start the understanding of second wave art and what this art means and performance and all of these different things that are occurring during this time period. Judy Chicago was also going to be very well known for this other work, The Dinner Party, in which she is going to make this monumental installation to feminist artists in which they're invited to a banquet. And so here is that image. I'll show you that right away, then we'll go back. 39 total place settings, each commemorating a particular woman from history. So you have these banners that lead you in. It's a concrete installation in the Brooklyn Museum now. You can go see it. It has a room that's built for it, which is just insanely gorgeous. But here you had all of these different plates and embroidered table runners, gold chalices, utensils. It very much becomes this sort of Last Supper, but featuring all these important female figures from the past and present. So here you have some of those as well. Hatshepsut, Judith, Georgia O'Keeffe, Emily Dickinson, and much of the plates are meant to represent vaginas. Very much reminiscent of Georgia O'Keeffe and her work, very sort of floral and geometric and vaginal in many ways. So if you want to look through these, you're welcome to, but I gave you a list of sort of all the different women that these different place settings move through. So there's one side that's from prehistory to the Roman Empire, another section that's from the beginnings of Christianity to the Reformation, and then from America to the Women's Revolution, ending with Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, there was also a floor made of individual tiles. This featured 999 women inscribed in the floor on the white tile. Other important women to history, to art history, that have been often ignored in the history of the world. And in this process, she collaborated with numerous other different women and volunteers who worked in these very womanly pursuits of crocheting, of embroidering, to make this massive piece. And she features all the women here in the exhibition. There is a lot of criticism surrounding sort of the second wave of feminism and how feminist art was viewed at the time. Hilton Kramer, who I think we've talked about, maybe we haven't, sort of Clement Greenberg of this time, right? Someone that the Guerrilla Girls hate, had a large hatred for feminist art. So the dinner party reiterates its theme with an insistence and vulgarity, more appropriate perhaps to an advertising campaign than to a work of art. He called the work not only a kitsch object, but also crass and solemn and single-minded, very bad art, failed art, art so mirrored in the pieties of a cause that it quite fails to acquire an independent artistic life of its own. So there are some criticisms about second wave that sort of stuck. There is a connection to essentialism of all women into one group. Not all artists want to use pinks and pastels in the making of something that's feminine. Cultural essentialism, assuming that we're all part of the same femininity, and defining what that is, and then sort of these sort of stereotypical ideas. And so second wave art wasn't necessarily accepted by everyone, but it was this move forward or historically. And so when we start next week looking at and reading this book on the themes of contemporary art, we'll see how people have reinterpreted those ideas in feminism, in performance, or otherwise. So I will talk to you guys next week.